Again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to this joint event by the EPC and the European Foundation for Democracy on the geostrategic aspects of jihadist radicalisation for session 2. My name is Andrea Frontini. I'm a policy analyst at the European Policy Centre, and I have the very pleasant task of chairing and moderating. Chairing and moderating this second session of the event with a number of outstanding speakers, and I would like to thank them very much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Helma Manea, Associate Professor at the University of Zurich, Head Hussein, Senior Advisor and Director of Strategy at the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, Mr. Nureddin Fridhi, journalist at the Brussels Bureau of Al Arabiya, and Karis Pastori, policy advisor at European External Action Service. And once again, many thanks to all of you for coming. I think Amanda has already emphasized the importance of the topics of today's discussion. But let me just emphasize maybe briefly some other aspects of the topics we will be dealing in this second session. Today this afternoon we'll probably be looking at what can arguably be considered as the geographic but also the ideonational, if you wish, core of the jihadist phenomenon in its international and growingly global ramification, namely the Gulf, the Middle East proper, and Northern Africa. And I think that an analysis of the various specificities of each region seems to suggest the existence of different and locally specific evolution and the proliferation of... I'm very unlucky.
No,
yeah? Okay, sorry. And the proliferation of different patterns of radicalization and extremism trends which are currently affecting each of the region we'll be looking at. And I'd like just maybe to mention a couple of issues, starting perhaps with the Gulf. I think that the Gulf has been historically the home of some of the most prominent leadership figures of the global jihad since the very creation of Al-Qaeda. Even earlier, if you wish, and the region remains, in many respects, a rather problematic source of radicalization, given the activities of some religious charities whose operation have admittedly long been underseen or ignored by several governments in the area, and that contributes to make domestic de-radicalization and the oversight of the funding mechanisms of radicalization in the Gulf a very prime mission for local authorities in the near future. I think also the activities of some organizations like the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula pose indeed a direct threat to the region, not only in hotspots like Yemen itself, but also in other countries like the petro-monarchies, so to say. And this provides, I think, an additional incentive for local governments to act on this problem. The Middle East itself has become, in a way, a topic which has made very big and sad headlines when it comes to jihadism. Rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria has witnessed the combination of radical ideology, state collapse, and the ability of radical movements to exploit these factors to increase their clout over the region. Perhaps the Syrian crisis has probably become the most visible example of this. Warring trends with the direct involvement of Shia militias of Hezbollah, which has complicated, if you wish, the interaction and also the ideological and sectarian depth of the confrontation in the region. And probably, beyond the military response which is being given by the international community, there is a need to add a much more comprehensive response to these challenges. Northern Africa, of course, also provides an instance of how, if you wish, violent extremism can smartly exploit vacuums of power within the countries, but also, if you wish, at a more general, global and regional level. And I think that it has also managed to exploit the rather contradictory trends which follow the Arab Spring since 2011, and it has taken deep roots into fragile and unstable political systems, and also in disintegrating societal context. The example of Libya, I think, is quite important, and we have seen the rise of Salafi movement, jihadist terrorist organization, ISIS, of course, but also Al-Qaeda, all the way to Ansar al-Sharia, and I think this are posing additional constraints of what we have seen indeed as a very difficult and fragile political transition in some of these countries. So I think the importance also of not only regional cooperation but also of an international-backed contribution to the reconstruction of the region, not only economic reconstruction but also all the societal sphere needs to be addressed. To end up this brief introduction, I'd also like to highlight the role of the EU when it comes to addressing the geostrategic aspects of radicalization. Of course, the rise of these threats in these regions pose a direct challenge to the very fundamental values of European societies, but also to the concrete interests of the EU and its member states. And I think that what we have seen with the Brussels and the Paris terrorist attacks before is that in many respects the idea that Europe could remain somewhat immune from these threats and challenges is and will probably remain an illusion for the next few years. I think that the EU has been ready to provide a strong input to its policy initiatives in the region, starting perhaps with the Foreign Affairs Council conclusion on counterterrorism in February 2015. The EU has particularly underlined the importance of increased international cooperation and support to the countries affected by the radicalization and jihadist phenomenon. And certainly I would say that counterterrorism and counterviolent extremism are somewhat blurring the dividing lines between internal and external security, and that can also perhaps provide an opportunity for the EU to build upon its specific role as a kind of multidimensional, multi-level policy actor. So I think this is an opportunity that the EU could take in collaboration, of course, with the local actors in the region. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our first speaker, Ms. Manea, for her introductory remarks on the Gulf region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think my interest at this point is to highlight the role of the states in promoting a certain kind of Salafism with regional and global consequences. We are ISIS. That is the title of an article written by the former Kuwaiti Minister of Information, Saad bin Tafla al-Ajami. And it was published by a Qatari newspaper in August 2014. And he wasn't celebrating ISIS nor its atrocities. In fact, he was basically making something that many of us living in the region, following what's happening, we seem to be acknowledging. He was reminding us that ISIS, while condemned by the majority of Muslims, is a product of an Islamic religious discourse that dominated the public sphere in countries of the Arabian Peninsula in the last decades, a mainstream discourse. He said ISIS didn't come from another planet. It is not a product of the infidel West or a bygone Orient. The truth that we cannot deny is ISIS learned from our schools, prayed in our mosques, listened to our media and our religious platforms, read from our books and preferences, and followed our fatwas. Fatwas we produced. And in fact, he was right. It was a political strategy of politics of survivor. And if you look at it from this perspective, you see a cynical kind of like approach from states eager to survive. And in their attempt to survive, they promote a certain kind of Salafism, and we are paying a price for it in the region. I come originally from Yemen, and I study Yemen as well, and we are paying a price, a heavy price for that. So the focus in this presentation is on the role played, and I will focus it on two Gulf states in sponsoring Salafi fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. And I argue that this sponsoring, while politically motivated, have repercussions regionally and globally. And any attempt to address the challenge of radicalization will be futile, from my perspective, without addressing these states' role in spreading Salafism in its different forms. Now, we've been talking all the time about Salafism. I would like to bring in a certain kind of definition. If you look at its historical roots, I tend to look at it from as a kind of a movement that emerged in a coherent form in the 14th century. It's like a reaction to a perceived corruption of Islamic faith and practice. While this is the case, it came about in the 18th century and in different parts, not only in Saudi Arabia, the heart of Saudi Arabia, Najd. You see it also in a South Asian context, in the Deobandi form, despite the fact that the Deobandi form is rooted in the Hanafi tradition. But nevertheless, if you look at their the way they were formed also by, how do they say, students of Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay. Most importantly, in the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th century, we are talking about a modern fundamentalist movement. Something that came about because someone, Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, he thought that there is a need for purifying Islam. He didn't think whatever Islam is surrounding him is a real Islam. So he came up with the idea of oneness of God. And in that tawheed, this idea is so radical to an extent that everybody who does not follow that form seems, from the perspective of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab and his followers, as non-believers. And that's why when we talk about the problem of Salafism, the problem has to do very much with the fact that when they come, they really try to eradicate whatever traditional religious practices present as non-Islamic. Definition, it refers to a puritanical religious movement which concerns itself with changing social behaviors, confirms to its rigid worldviews, call for a strict Islamic mode of life, and separate its followers from its wider society. And the wider society can be Muslim and can be non-Muslim. Okay? So it's important to look at it from this perspective. And of course, they follow a very literal reading of the scripture, and especially hostile toward Muslims of other traditions, the Shia, the Sufi, Al-Ahmadiyya, you just name it. There are three strands of Salafism today, and I'm using here the classification of the colleague Viktorovich. I thought it was a very good one, in fact. He classified them into three groups: the purists, and these are, they emphasize a focus on nonviolent methods of propagation, purification, and education. And they view politics as a diversion that encourages deviancy and call for obedience to the Muslim rulers. It's very important. This is very important from the perspective of those rulers. While this is the case, when we say non-violent, in fact, the consequences of their propagation can be very violent within society. When you start basically preach and saying Ahmadi are non-Muslims, and you cannot basically claim to be a Muslim. This type of incitement can lead to a situation, as we see in Indonesia, for instance, where Ahmadi groups were asked to leave their own island because the other Salafi groups considered them non-Muslim. Okay? If we look in Kuwait, in the Gulf context, you have the revival of Islamic Heritage Society. That's the type of purist group. In Saudi Arabia, the religious establishment is one of a purist type. You look at the second group, the second classification, the politicos, which emphasize the application of the Salafi creed to the political arena, and they view as particularly important because it dramatically impacts social justice and the right of God alone to legalize. We've seen this development in Egypt with the An-Nur party, where they which was something new to them. In Kuwait, in fact, you have this development since the 80s with the Salafi Islamic gathering. But while they are politicos, participate in political system, they nevertheless insist on obedience to the Emir. So they're participating with a certain kind of twist to the idea of politicos. In Saudi Arabia, it started with the Islamic Sahwa awakening in the 90s, and are especially critical of the Saudi dynasty, I would put it this way. And then the third are the jihadis. Those are basically not content, and you see here a certain kind of like infusion between certain writings of the Muslim Brotherhood, specifically when it comes to Sayyid Qutb, the militant type of Muslim Brotherhood, infusion with the ideology of Salafi Islam, and argue that the current context calls for violence and revolution. And all three factions share a common creed, but offer a different explanation of the contemporary world. And the splits are about contextual analysis. And that's very important in this work of Viktorovitz, because he made sure for us to understand that it's a kind of a spectrum. They just disagree on when do we use violence. So it's when do we use violence. Now, while the context may differ in each of the two countries that I will talk about right now, not all types of Salafisms are welcome inside of these two countries. Okay? So if I talk about Saudi Arabia, for instance, Saudi Arabia is a state, it's like it's the whole state is based on this kind of pledge, a kind of alliance between Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi movement, and Muhammad ibn Saud, the founder of the Saudi dynasty. It took place in 1744. The idea was to create a state according to these principles. Now, this pledge was reinstated in 92 with the founder of the modern Saudi Arabia, and together with an army of Ikhwan brothers, they basically created, expanded. It was a kind of a holy war that remind us of what's happening with ISIS, sometimes with the atrocities that were committed against the Shia population in the eastern part, and the destruction of their shrines. But while this is the case, the main impact was basically there was a certain historical moment, and that is very important, an emphasis that I would like to highlight here, where it became clear after a certain confrontation in 1926 that the one who's calling the shot within Saudi Arabia is the king, the dynasty. Those who are on a second level are the Islamists, the religious establishment. And you have a certain kind of an agreement where when it comes to the foreign policy, when it comes to issues of oil, arm deals, the royal family seem to be very much in control. But when it comes to the domestic situation, those who are shaping the domestic situation are the religious establishment. Locally, and that's important, inside of Saudi Arabia, the kingdom supports and privileges the purists, allow them a free hand in dictating the social behavior and control of the education system. But the kingdom will crack down on the politicos and jihadis. They will try to co-opt the political Salafis. If it doesn't work, they will crack down on them, and most of them are right now in the prison. And the reason is simple, because they threaten the political stability. However, regionally and globally, on the other hand, the kingdom supports the three types of Salafism. Inside, we support a certain type, but outside, we support the three types depending on the context. Depending on the context. Yes. Yes. It exports Sunni Salafism across the globe, okay, through mosques, schools, scholarships, money. During the 60s and 70s, it was a means to fight pan-Islamism, pan-Arabism, I'm sorry, and communism. You mentioned that in, about the Cold War in your presentation. Later, it was used to fight Iran for religious hegemony. But in all of that, it's real politics. It's from the perspective of the dynasty. This is real politics. It's like it's not something about religion. No, it's real politics. You know, you have individuals, of course, in the family. You have also certain kind of, as you said, which Saudis who are doing this because of real belief. But if you look from the perspective of the dynasty, it's survival. So it's like I'd like to basically expand my hegemony, and specifically when it concerns a country like Iran. Kuwait, on the other hand, is not the same as Saudi Arabia. You have a parliamentarian system here. If you please don't forget Kuwait history. It's a country with an established parliamentarian system. It's like the Emir, in order to expand his own budget, he has to take the permission of the parliament. Okay? But while this is the case, from the perspective of the regime, it was important to ally with Salafis, first with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then afterwards with the Salafis in their two types, politicals and purists, because it was easier. It was easier. So it's like you have an opposition of nationalists, of leftists, and right now of liberals who are very much concerned with good governance. You know, they're very much concerned of like constraining the limits of the royal family and their ruling. And then you have, on the other hand, Islamists whose main interest is, on the one hand, constraining social behavior, focus on women's body, segregation. You know, these things are not problematic from the perspective of the royal family. Okay. On the other hand, while you have this kind of quasi-arrangement between the two of them, sides, Islamists were allowed to grow, and this had consequences. Because until today, every time we talk about the Salafis, we talk about Saudi Arabia, we talk sometimes about Qatar, but we don't talk about the Kuwaitis. And they're playing a very important role. I mean, if you look at the Salafis, it's like they have a real transnational linkages. And since decades, these different Kuwaiti Salafi groups, charities, have been among the most important bankroll of the Salafi movements worldwide. And the charity individual donors are financing the building and maintenance of thousands of Salafi mosques and other institutions worldwide. And they've been very active after the Arab Spring, and not only in Syria, you know. And this is a sort of problem, because if you look, and I'm coming to an end, if you look at the consequences here, when we talk about what are the repercussions of this, because from the perspective of the state, it's a survival tactic, it's real politics. The consequences, on the other hand, are grave, specifically for societies. And we've been, our colleagues, distinguished colleagues in the previous panels, they showed the consequences in different geographical levels. And if you look within the countries themselves, in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait, of course there are also consequences. It's like you have supporting the purists at home. That reflects on the social cohesion of society in a country like Saudi Arabia, which is diverse in its population structure. And one has Shia tradition, you have Zaydi tradition, the Ismaili, Sufi, all of these traditions are living there. But you have one that is telling them, as like all of these traditions are deviant in comparison to ours, you know, and it reflects also in a certain counter-radicalization that takes place. I've seen that in another context in Yemen, where the Houthis' Zaidi tradition, which is usually moderate, it turned into a radicalization process. When the Salafi started to encroach on their region in Saada, you know. So reflect on the social cohesion, human and women's rights as well. Blasphemy cases, it became like an issue, a big issue in Kuwait. Kuwait had a history of freedom of press, and that is being restricted right now to an extent that one realizes it's things are being shaped by this line of Islamism dominating, as this minister said it, we mainstreamed their own ideology. And of course, the religious discourse provide an enabling pull for radicalization. And finally, regionally and globally, let's eradicate the local religious traditions. You have sectarian strife, whatever they are, there is sectarian strife. And enable, again, pull for radicalization. I'm not going to talk about Syria and Iraq, but in Yemen, it changed the demographic structure. It really changed it. And changed it in a way that radicalization of the Houthi, I mentioned it, even if you look, it's like Yemen was a front against the socialist south of Yemen, north of Yemen I'm talking here. And Saudi Arabia and also the United States were very interested. Were very interested in making a stop to this socialist ideology, and they did it through building mosques, madrasas, and it changed our structure. And the interesting part right now with the civil war that we are having, you have Saudi Arabia and the United States fighting ISIS, okay? And then Saudi Arabia is supporting local actors fighting Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh. And in their fight, they are working together with militias associated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This like, makes like a little bit, if you understand that, please tell me. and then on Oman, there's a dimension also. You have, it's the last point that I'm going to mention here. Oman is you have a country with a comfortable majority of another tradition, neither Sunni nor Shia. It's called Abadi, okay? And you have one region that used to have a historically big problems, the Dhufar region. You know, in the 70s, it was a focus for the communist kind of rebellion. But you look closer, you see it's a Sunni region. You have certain kind of economic factors that led to their rebellion. Right now, this Yemeni situation seems to be threatening to spill over in the region. So the consequences on the local level, on the regional level, and on the global level are very important. And that's why it's important to ensure that these countries also come to terms with their own role. And I'm not sure if that's realistic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this analysis, very thought-provoking, and raised several issues that we can try to expand a bit on in the Q&A. For the sake of having meaningful debate with the audience, I would pass the floor quickly to Mr. Hussain. If you can kindly stick to 12, 15 minutes maximum.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, all of you, for making time. A particular thanks to the EPC and the European Foundation for Democracy for inviting me, and to John Dewig for following up from last month's, it was last month, wasn't it? Or was it earlier this month? There was a huge session in the European Parliament that addressed a similar theme. It's encouraging for those of us who've been on this agenda in various ways, be it in my situation in London, Jeddah, Damascus, Washington, D.C. and New York. That's been the story of my trajectory for the last kind of 7 years. It's encouraging to hear someone like Ilham sit here today and talk about this issue with the candor and the criticism and the courage that she does, because it wasn't always possible to be critical of the actors that she highlighted, nor, to be blunt, the ideology and the theology that's driving this terrorism. Too often we're counting bodies. Too often we're upping the terror alerts without realizing, as Ilham rightly identified, that there's a theology and ideology driving that. Now, I just want to say that, by way of a caveat, everything I'll say from here onwards is not a criticism of Islam. So those of us in this room who come from a Muslim background, or those of you who come from a Christian, Jewish, or a non-faith background, part of the problem here in Europe is we don't understand religion anymore, never mind understand Islam, a third religion, never mind understand extremism within Islam, and never mind understand Salafi jihadi theology behind it. So it's 3 or 4 removed, and that's part of the broader problem we have here in Europe as a civilization, as a culture. Now, so everything I'm talking about is of 2 forces. One, Ilham's absolutely right, Salafism, and second is Islamism. And by Islamism, I mean the politicization of Islam. I mean the influences of communism and of socialism on Muslim discourse. It's not some kind of post-colonial guilt, and it's not about blaming America. It's about understanding that Muslim societies globally have failed to politicize in the kind of center, center-left, center-right, pluralist manner. And what we've made the mistake of is absorbing this kind of revolutionary politics. You know, the Arab nationalists, you know, nationalist socialists, what do we call them in this part of the world? You know, right? Yeah, Baathists, or, you know, Gamal Abdel Nasser's people. We had a history of that here in the 1930s, nationalist socialists. And that's the kind of mindset that's given birth to where we are in the Arab world. But without digressing too much, I want to do 2 things. Firstly, share with you research that I am a senior advisor also to the Centre on Religion and Geopolitics, a think tank we run out of our foundation. We commissioned a study. Our researchers undertook a thorough study of the world's 100 top jihadists. It was done on open source material, most of it. And our findings are that 46% of our sample, includes people like Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and others, went to university. So this notion that they're somehow uneducated and don't know what they're talking about doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
They have done PhD.
Yeah, in Tajweed. So now 51% of our sample, just over half of them, went from non-violent jihadi or Islamist groups to becoming violent jihadists. So it's not just that they wake up one morning and they become violent extremists, but there is a trajectory involved. So many of them are members of the Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations. So they absorb a worldview that is inherently non-violent, but nonetheless problematic ideologically. That's just over 50% of our sample. 57% of those that went to university studied STEM subjects. In other words, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. That's telling you something about the worldview that they have, the way in which they approach text. Is not the way in which a kind of a theologian or an English literature graduate or a lawyer or a historian would. You're coming at it from a black and white, right and wrong, no color, no nuance, no context, no history, no metaphor. This is a manual, medical manual, engineering manual. That's how you then approach scripture. The Quran becomes a manual, a book of rights and wrongs, an equation, a formula. And all the spirituality, the depth, the beauty, the Sufism, the ideas that gave us the Taj Mahal, the Blue Mosque, that heritage is lost because you're then stuck with obliterating the evil that Ilham spoke about and then reinforcing it with their version of capital T truth. I'll come to more of that in a moment. Now, 76% of our sample of the world's 100 leading jihadists were involved in 4 conflict zones around the world, either in the Levant, Iraq, Syria, the Sahel region, Algeria, Mali, AFPAC, or increasingly in East Africa, Somalia, Kenya. So those global conflicts produce people or attract people who are Islamists and jihadis. Now, I just want to do a little bit of questioning some of the conventional wisdom that our policymakers hold. And this applies, I think, here in Brussels as much as it does to my friends in Washington, D.C., and that is that this belief that, that it's about ghettos and the lack of integration and ghettoization that's led to this radicalization and problem globally. Well, I ask you, Jewish people were ghetto residents, lived in the ghettos of Warsaw, other parts of Europe, London included. Why didn't they become suicide bombers, or at least a portion of them become suicide bombers? Those who throw the argument around that it's about poverty, that it's all because young Muslims around the world and elsewhere are poor. Well, I ask you, among the poorest countries in the world are Bangladesh and Senegal, both homes to a pluralist, moderate form of Islam. Why is radicalisation and extremism not a problem en masse in Bangladesh or in Senegal? Why is it that in Saudi Arabia or indeed Kuwait or in Qatar, where GDP per capita is among the highest in the world if you take Norway out of the equation, why is it in those countries that people are more radical? Why was Osama bin Laden, a multimillionaire, radicalized? Ayman al-Zawahiri comes from a prestigious Zawahiri family of medical professionals and Al-Azhar teachers. Indeed, his grandfather was the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar. So that's the poverty issue. Alienation, people coming over from the Indian subcontinent or elsewhere, say in the case of the UK. Well, Sikhs and Hindus also come from the Indian subcontinent. Why are they not producing people, or a section of them, wanting to blow up others and bring mass strife to society? Unemployment. Well, in the UK at least, the people who are most unemployed tend to be the white working class in large cities such as Bradford and parts of East London and parts of Glasgow. Well, why are they not turning to extremist organizations? And answer that question in yourself, and I think it takes you to something that's interesting. Those who want to conventionally blame foreign policy, America, Britain, and the West, and foreign policies to blame. By the way, I'm not discounting all the above factors. I'm saying that just saying that those factors alone explain the problem, I think misses something that's very, very important. Well, foreign policy, okay, Iraq, fine, let's assume it was a mistake. So there was no Western intervention in Syria. Why is there a problem now in Syria? There was no Western intervention in Libya, or a sustained intervention in the way that we wanted to. All the crimes that the West is accused of, Israel is also accused of in terms of foreign policy blunders, i.e. Gaza, Lebanon, Egypt. Israel has a 50-year history of belligerence or response to belligerence from its neighbors. Why is Israel not attacked by ISIS or by extremist suicide bombers from the wider region? I mean, ask yourself that question. If it's all about foreign policy, why was Belgium attacked? Yes, you know, we can talk about all the factors that I highlighted: ghettoization, poverty, alienation, unemployment, foreign policy, and so on. But we've got to be open that this is essentially a battle of ideas. We are up against a worldview that wants to negate, wants to destroy what's been built in this part of the world and what's aspired to by other parts of the world. And the values that I'm referring to here, we take them for granted. But in large parts of the world, the values that I'm about to highlight to you matter. In this room, they may not have an echo, but they matter deeply in Damascus. They matter hugely in Jakarta. And those values are values that people in Delhi and elsewhere are aspiring towards and building modern democracies to try and create. They include, you know, the rule of law. You know, that may not mean anything to us anymore, but the rule of law means something to people who don't have the rule of law and live under the rule of the secret police. Gender equality. We may take that for granted, but it matters vastly in countries such as Egypt, in which 51% of the population happen to be women. 99.9%, according to a UN report, have encountered sexual harassment. Even the UN, of the most politically correct organizations, has stats like 99.9% put out there. So just think about the fact that we're trying to defend something that's under attack. Racial equality, again, religious pluralism, those are ideas and values that have been developed through giving blood and lives in this part of the world and now aspired towards rightly. And by the way, these are not values that are in contradiction with Islam and Muslim society. So if you want to think that somehow this is colonization and the white man's value being imposed on the rest of the world, it's just not true. If you think that, I refer you to understanding what's called the Maqasid al-Sharia approach to understanding Islam by Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya out of the Emirates. And you see how the soul of the Sharia, or the spirit of the Sharia, is fully in line with these values, and they are indeed universal values. And that's what's under attack right now from both Islamists and Salafists. I have just under 4 minutes, so I'll be very quick in trying to build a little more of what Ilham was talking about. And I've got 5 broad points to make, and I'll be very quick. First, Ilham was absolutely right in highlighting this obsession with Tawheed, the oneness of God. Now, Christians, Muslims, Jews all believe in the one God. Indeed, I'd argue Hindus and others do as well. Dara Shikor's work bears testament to that. But enforcing that oneness of God and enforcing it politically, enforcing it violently, is where you see the modern literalism of the Salafi school of thought. And by literalism, I'm talking about the kind of STEM mindset, the kind of disregarding context, history, ijma, consensus of Muslim scholars brought up over centuries. Now, this isn't just abstract theology. There's a reason why the Bahmian Buddhas were blown up. There's a reason why Sufi shrines are attacked. There's a reason why synagogues are attacked. There's a reason why churches are being obliterated. There's a reason why Palmyra was attacked. So often it's kind of depressing watching the news, because when human lives are lost, we tend to think, okay, 50 more Iraqis killed, is what they do. But when Palmyra goes up in flames, oh my God, how dare they attack historical heritage sites? So whether it's killing humans or whether it's killing or destroying historical sites, underlying that is this mindset of literalism and mindset of something called takfir, that whether it's on governments or whether it's on individuals, that they're not adequately Muslim. I'm struggling to explain because I'm struggling against time. So, so there's first the literalism point. On the back of literalism is a separatism that Salafis and Salafi jihadis pursue. That separatism is underscored by something called al-wala wal-bara, that only their kind of Islam, their interpretation of Islam is valid. The 1400 years of scholarship, by the Iranians and the Turks, by the Egyptians and others, is invalid. Only the Salafi literalism that's been developed out of the Najd, exported through Medina University now, is the only valid form. And that then creates a whole group of imams and others who are against Shia Muslims, Sufi Muslims, non-Muslims. So only their form of Islam is valid. What that then leads to is takfir, or excommunicating others, including fellow Muslims. So the vast majority of the world's Muslims, to them, are non-Muslims, or at best mushrik, or kind of polytheists. Now, those of you who aren't kind of engrossed in literature might think, what is all of this stuff? But I'm sorry, that stuff is driving the violence out there. That stuff is visiting your streets, and that stuff will continue to get worse unless we try and understand some of this stuff. So takfir is one. By the way, this didn't just come up in Pakistan randomly. Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, was killed because of this takfiri notion in 1981. Sayyid Qutb was the one who popularized this most because of the repression he was put under by this nationalist socialist government called the Gamal Abdel Nasser government in Egypt. Now, this is all done for a reason. The takfir, the separatism, the literalism is designed to create a state, Hakimiyya. Now, 7 years ago when we spoke about this Hakimiyya or this Khilafah state, everyone thought we were in cloud cuckoo land and being alarmist and attacking us. Well, now there's ISIS to sadly, destructively, regrettably prove our point, that they are geared towards taking over governments. And through governments, they want to impose their worldview. What's halal and haram, right, or forbidden, not forbidden for Muslims, it doesn't mean that it becomes legal and illegal. But with the government, what they want to do is impose that worldview. So that's the fourth strand. They do this, they pursue this via jihad. Al-Qaeda was one, Egypt's Gamal Islamiyya was another, Algeria was another manifestation. So don't get distracted by ISIS, because ISIS will be gone. Al-Qaeda will be gone, someone else will emerge. Before them, there was Abdul Salam al-Faraj, there was Takfir wal-Hijra, there was Sayyid Qutb's movement. This is an ideology that has manifestations, that has symptoms, and unless we get to the root cause of it, the theological, ideological worldview, no matter how much money we put through our bureaucracies to it, we won't end it. Two last points to end. One is that all of this, by the way, is driven by a certainty that, or yaqeen as they call it, they alone are on capital T truth, and by killing themselves for this, they will gain an afterlife, a Jannah, in which they will be rewarded. Now, unless we and our Muslim scholars and allies in this part of the world and the Muslim East are able to say no, by killing yourselves you are going to hell, as Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hansen said, not heaven, we won't get through to them. Unless we get through to them using the language they understand, they don't have doubt. Unless they have doubt, they don't stop the actions they take. We may fault that logic, but it is a logical worldview. I've got, I'm out over time, so I'll just quickly finish by saying that ideology bred in the Muslim East will resonate in the West here among young Muslims and converts. Large numbers of people from France going out there are converts. So don't think white, blonde, blue-eyed people are immune from this problem. Conversion is a huge cool and attraction point. Because underlying all of this is where I started. Europe not knowing what it stands for, weakness in defending its own civilization, not prepared to give its life, its own soldiers, the public mood isn't prepared to fight ISIS on the ground. What that then leads to is a lack of belonging, a lack of purpose, a lack of meaning, a lack of identity here in Europe. I come from a country where we're having a referendum whether we should be part of the European Union or not. And I think what that does to young Muslims growing up, they're neither British, they're neither Muslim, they're neither European, neither Pakistani, who are they? And in that kind of global orphanage, Islamists and Salafists offer them belonging, purpose and meaning through this ideology and theology that offers them a sense of sustenance in this world and the next world. Unless we can beat that appeal, we will continue to fight this ugliness in our midst for time to come.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hussein. Apologies for the time pressure, but thank you very much for sticking to the time given. And I think both the first two presentations looked quite frankly at the ideological roots of the problems, how it developed in terms of principles, also the use or misuse that has been made of such ideology in your respective regions. Let me get to the third speaker, Mr. Frithi, who will look at Northern Africa, I think in Tunisia in particular. Please stick to the 15 minutes maximum so we have enough space then for the debate. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about Tunisia as a case where the jihadists evolved and are today enough violent. In the previous session, and Madame Ilham mentioned the impact of the Iranian Revolution on the Islamic movement in all the Muslim countries and even Europe, etc. But in the case of Tunisia, I remember one of the leading figure in the Nahda told me, in the beginning of 80s, the Tunisian regime had some security problem with the Islamic movement, and he got, at that time, Ben Ali, our former president, used to be the Minister of Interior, and he got a meeting, has been in meeting with Prince Naif bin, the Saudi, his colleague, the Saudi colleague, and he advised him that the Saudis can help the Tunisian to promote the Salafism, to contain the impact of, at that time, called the Islamic movement, which is the, let's say, the basis for Nahda, the political and the Muslim Brotherhood political party in Tunisia. And the Tunisian government allowed a kind of Salafist group working, let's say, in a way to contain the Muslim Brotherhoods in Tunisia, but they failed. But the problem that I myself do deliberately mix very often between the jihadists and the Muslim Brotherhoods, because sometimes they are interlinked, sometimes not. But sometimes they are interlinked, and they are, even when they are in running the country like Tunisia, at some level, they cooperate. And they cooperate very well. But back in the 80s, we used to have, unfortunately, the beginning of the jihadist or the violent extremism in Tunisia when they tried to bomb 4 hotels in the touristic area. They failed, but at least they killed 1 security guard in some other political section in Tunis. And the paradox for us as a Tunisian, that some of the suspected and condemned sentenced people at that time, they became our ministers of interior, for example, after our beautiful Jasmine revolution. So this is this linkage, and we will find later on after the revolution that the Islamic movement running the country, they were enough tolerant. They freed all the jihadists in our country, and we found them, I confronted them as a journalist, let's say. They are organizing religious police in the political suburbs. They are intimidating the intellectual women organization, students, journalists, etc. I myself interviewed the Prime Minister, the Home Affairs Minister, the President of the Parliament about how aggressive they are in these in these popular suburbs, etc. And they told me it was and media exaggeration. But I have on the record until today in some suburbs, the publicly and soundly calling for the jihad in Syria in 2012, 2013. And I have, with my own picture, with my own camera, recorded in publicly collect of money to the jihadists in Tunisia. So first of all, they freed all the jihadists that were in prison in Ben Ali. They allowed them to work in the popular suburbs. They allowed them to occupy mosques. Another objective factor was, unfortunately for us, that Libya at that time was run by a Muslim Brotherhood government, which is a very rich government. So all this propaganda for jihad in Syria was financed by the Libyan government and Libyan Islamic groups, assuming that the Nahda and the Islamic groups in Tunisia do not have. But Mr. Rashid Al-Ghanouchi, who is very often in Europe described a very moderate man, we have on the record, and it was on YouTube in 2012, calling the Salafis to be just patient, because Tunisia was under the influence of secular, and it takes time for them to, let's say, re-Islamize the society. So that's why, for example, many colleagues ask why there are so many Tunisians in Syria, despite this is the country of the Jasmine revolution. So we had an Islamic government which was tolerant with the jihadists. We had them working in the mosques. We had the Libyan Muslim Brotherhoods financing. So the result that thousands of mercenaries went to Syria via Turkey. This is the situation. But we were so lucky by what the Tunisian Republic School produced. We resisted. Thanks to women organization, to the seculars, to the liberals, to the trade unions, we had to face them with a very weak army. So we didn't use army, etc., etc. And finally, yes, they had to resign. Unfortunately, as you can understand very well, the democratic process is taking time in our societies. So the liberals are left thinking, etc. They are enough, let's say, divided and not enough mature to have this big alliance. And I imagine that Nahda will be back again. It is partly in power, but it will be back. In the end, we are really, I myself felt that we are moving towards a kind of accepting each other. It's the beginning, but when I go back to Tunisia, I feel the Tunisian accepting the other Tunisian. I'm not suggesting Tunisians are accepting jihadists at all. No, at all. Since the Nahda left the power, the state is back, the security service is back, security situation is improving. Of course, I'm not trying to say that we forget what happened last year with the 59 killed tourists in Tunisia, but dozens of civilian army security guards, etc., soldiers are killed. We still have our neighbor in Libya in a very weak situation, a very dangerous situation. Libya is for us is an open market to be supplied with arms and ammunition. The European Union, United States, France, Germany, Italy are on bilateral level working with the Tunisian government to rebuild security services or rearm the army, let's say, equip the army. Things are going better. There is one interesting development happened 2 days before with the political Congress of Nahda, which comes with an outcome to separate what they called the political activities from the religious activities. Very often, before this revolution and some years before, we were asking ourselves, is it possible that one day the Islamic movement will change its mind and behave like how the Christian Democrats parties behave? One obvious answer that it will take time. It's taking time. Does that mean what happened in Tunisia today is a step of this? I myself, not among the Islamo-gauchists, so I do not believe in the separation between the political activities and the religious activities, because I believe that the Nahda, as a Muslim brotherhood, I can't imagine someone stopping to be a Muslim brotherhood. It means that he doesn't believe in Khilafah. It means he doesn't believe in a religious state. So he should do something in his mind as a revolution to change that. I don't think one Muslim brotherhood can abandon his ideals for to build a Khilafah, an Islamic Khilafah or an Islamic state. Now, if it happened, we will be very happy, but let's say I'm myself suspicious about that, and I'm not among the Islamo-gauchists. Because we have been there, I've been Islamo-gauchist during the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and it cost too much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting reflection indeed on the potential evolution also of Islamist electoral movements like Ennahda in Tunisia. I think it's a very big debate still going on, and maybe we can touch upon that later on. Let me get to Ms. Pastori to provide an EU perspective on some of these issues and the foreign policy dimension of EU's action towards violent extremism in the region.
Thank you very much. I tend to sort of look very closely at the subject title before when I'm being asked what to speak about, and I did in this case. And actually, when I received the invitation, it did not yet say jihadist radicalisation. It only said radicalisation, and I think that's a very good starting point. Because when we talk about radicalisation, this is not something that solely or necessarily befalls the Muslim community or the Middle East. We have that in other countries as well. And as Ed very importantly said, when you talk about radicalisation, you don't necessarily mean terrorism or violence. There is a step before that is very important to identify, and you talk about radicalisation long before you talk about terrorism or violence. As a short side answer to a question in the previous panel, because somebody said, do people learn from each other? Even the means that are being used is not new. The first suicide bomber actually were the jihadi in the 1st century after Christ, and the first modern suicide bomber in the sense that we know it was in 1881 against Tsar Alexander, not an Islamist, by the way, just to make that point. So nothing is necessarily new, but you need to look at the underlying ideology issues, and here very much the ideology is what you can do. Hence, sort of when this entire sort of story, particularly with Daesh, etc., came up, of course, the first thing I think that everybody did in capitals, in Brussels, etc., is looking at the profiles, trying to understand what is happening here and why. And a lot of things have already been said here. I shall repeat some of them very shortly. I think the previous speaker from Bosnia gave a wonderful explanation or sort of analysis what the Bosnian foreign fighter scene looks like. And I can assure you that despite the fact that the majority of Austrian foreign fighters is from Bosnian origin, the profile is completely different. So the only thing that we do know is that there is no commonalities. You have rich, poor, white, brown, Muslim, converts, middle class, upper class, lower class, employed, unemployed. There is no combination that does not exist, literally. What I think we do need to do, in particular for what I have to speak about here, is to differentiate between what motivates somebody from our countries, from European Union countries, to go there and become a foreign fighter, and what motivates somebody from down there in the countries affected to join that fight, because there is a huge differentiation and a huge differentiation in the policy responses to that. But other than that, it is very difficult to categorize or differentiate. The next thing that does not exist, and I will continue like this, I will tell you a lot of things that we are not doing or that we are suggesting not to do anyway, because I think they're important to mention as well, not just the things that we are doing, is you have to differentiate between underlying issues and underlying narratives, and that is not the same thing. A classic case in point would be Palestine, for example. Palestine and all of the opinion polls, including the ones that Ed does, usually comes out as a major driver, researcher, and motivator for foreign fighters to go. If you look at it more closely, if you're a Palestinian who lives in the occupied territories, it is indeed a mobilizer. If you are somebody from Austria to join the jihad there, it is a narrative. And it is really important to understand the difference. Same with sectarianism, by the way, etc. It is really important to understand, to differentiate in the policy responses between what is an underlying issue and what is an underlying narrative, which is not the same thing. The next thing that there is not there is, I'm starting to sound like Ed because he did a lot of stuff that is not there, but I'm sort of complimenting it, is there is no automatism, sort of what causes what. One of the things that you have not mentioned, but is sort of oppression, because we talk about foreign policy in this case and not about domestic. Oppression causes terrorism and reaction. Don't get me wrong, I'm not speaking on behalf of oppression here, and certainly not on behalf of the European Union, but there is an automatism. You do have state terror countries that do not produce radicalisation in any way or form. Look at North Korea, for example. I'm not aware of any North Korean terrorists. Whereas in liberal democracies, you do have radicalisation and terrorism without any oppression. So there is no automatisms. Which brings us to the next point. So Ed already started on the subject. There is one common denominator, particularly when it comes to the form of radicalisation and terrorism that we're speaking about here and now, which is jihadi radicalisation. And that is a certain form of Islam. And a lot have been said about it today. Actually, it is not Islam. I insist on differentiating between Islam as a religion and Islamism as a political ideology. And Islamism, just as any political ideology, is in itself radical and absolutist and perfectionist, because any ideology thinks that it has found the answer to the world's problems and the future. So regardless whether it is violent Islamism or terrorism, Islamism as such has underlying issues such as any ideology, particularly if it is not incorporated in an existing framework of institutions and rules-based, somebody talked about rules-based society, which have vanished, particularly in countries of conflict, where you create space. And when we talk about creating space, we do not only mean territory, that is really important, we come to Libya afterwards, but we talk about ideological space, we talk about structures, starting from family. Can I still look up to my father, who was a member of the Ba'ath Party all his years and is now sort of not finding a job and has to hide himself? Can I still, as a Palestinian kid, can I look up to a father whom I've seen arrested and dragged away by the Israeli forces? So starting from family structures to bigger in the state institution structures, somebody mentioned the institutions of Iraq, the moment you structures disappear, they will be filled. Vacuums will be filled. It's a law of physics. And it applies in politics as well. Where was I going with this? The next sort of do not fall for simple explanations. We talked a lot about Salafism today, and I'm really, really glad for your explanations, because there's, for 20 or 30 years, particularly since the 79 revolution, sort of we thought we had found the Kaiser Sose, and it was the Iranian revolutionary Islamism that was the source of all evil. Then for about 5 years after the Arab Spring, the world made us, some people tried to make us believe it was the Muslim Brotherhood, which is way too short, even though they have a lot to account for. And now people have discovered Salafism, and most of the people who mention it have no clue what they're talking about. You are clearly exempted here. So I'm really, really grateful for this differentiation, including not just about the underlying religion, but also the Saudi actions. It is way more complicated, which is what no politician ever wants to hear, but it is way more complicated and differentiated. For example, the Saudi actions changed a lot actually after the Islamic Revolution and after the storm in Mecca in 79. There was a huge shift, and a second shift was again after 2003-4 when they started to be attacked themselves. So some of these presumed truths, because they look like, I can understand politicians and also some analysts who are looking for simple answers, because if we only identify that one problem, then we eradicate that one problem and the world is a fine place again. Unfortunately, we can't offer you that one problem that we can eradicate. It is way more, way broader. I've already mentioned sort of the sectarian. It is not the Sunni-Shia divide, while it is a schism and has been a schism for a great many hundreds of years, and while there has been sort of continuous on and off conflict, it is not the underlying issue. It is not one of the things that divides Muslims from each other or Muslims from the West. It is once again one of these underlying narratives. Sectarianism works perfectly for mobilization, again for giving identity, by saying you and us, and by creating subgroups to which you can say, I belong and you do not belong. All of this is part of the takfirism that we already talked about. Last but not least, somebody else mentioned this again, do not fall into the victimization narrative. You mentioned it and somebody else mentioned it earlier. Middle Easterners and Muslims are no more or less masters of their own destiny than anybody else in the universe. It's not Sykes-Picot, who was never implemented, who is to blame, nor is it the Iraq invasion, which certainly didn't help. I give you that, and I worked in Iraq 4.5 years, so I was there. But to say that the American policy or whatever is simply trying to find short answers which will not work because they're not true. Now, after having told you everything that we cannot do, give me sort of, let me give you a very complicated answer of what it is that we are doing. But I think it needed this explanation before that, because if I only had given you the complicated answer, you would have thought this is typical European and very complex and complicated and different institutions. But there is a necessity for this differentiated and complicated approach. The main subject, I think, of the day has probably been Daesh, and is hence Iraq and Syria. I think we all agreed that Daesh is a consequence and not the origin of the problem. It's a consequence that started in Iraq. We talked about it. It was not just predictable, but even predicted, including by people like myself since 2010. And it is not something that can be tackled on our own. So foreign policy, again, had its limits. You do need the buy-in of the local political classes. And we talked about this before. I think you mentioned it, somebody else in the first thing. As long as you have a political class who actually who thinks that it suits their own interest and purpose short term, but short term is a relative timeline for many people. To keep it the way it is, there is nothing we can do in terms of technical counterterrorism or in terms of foreign policy or in terms of political development or economic development. There is absolutely nothing we can do. So we depend on the goodwill, which partly you create, also with carrots and sticks, but this is the first thing that you do. We talked a little bit. The Daesh, so we just on Monday we reiterated or slightly revised, or actually reviewed is the better word, the European Union Daesh, Iraq, Syria strategy, not because it's one thing at all, and we make very, very clear that we need to differentiate, but because they're interlinked. So basically, without the conflict in Iraq, there wouldn't have been a Daesh, they wouldn't have moved over to Syria. Without Mr. Assad, Daesh wouldn't be the same issue, etc. We have, hence, a very differentiated strategy trying to address this package of issues together. Very, very short when it comes to Daesh, focuses on limiting the foreign fighters flow, particularly with the help of Turkey, border reasons, etc. Financing, we talked a little bit about financing. Actually, here again, I have to excuse my Saudi friends a little bit. There's from amongst the Gulf countries, the Saudi actually have the best CT financing from all of them, and the Kuwait is the worst, as you correctly said. But also the selling of artifacts, etc. It's not just state financing, and even foreign donor financing is currently the smallest contribution to the financing of terrorist organizations. They are self-financed big conglomerates. They are enterprises. They are selling oil, they are selling artifacts, they are selling women, they are selling drugs, they are selling anything they find. They don't need foreign donations that much. CBN, threats, strategic communications, airstrikes, whatever you want. On Syria, the main point is and remains the transition. No transition, which is the reason for the civil war, which again, certainly Mr. Assad has something to do with, that we will not be able to end the Daesh problem either. I think we have now for 5 years debated Daesh first or Assad first, and I think we're finally coming to a common understanding we have to do it in parallel, because doing one or the other doesn't work. On Iraq, the easiest and the most complicated thing in Iraq, sometimes I'm half-jokingly saying we have to be grateful for Daesh being there, because if it wasn't there, some of the open fault lines would become much more apparent than they are currently. And I think the moment Daesh will begin, they will become more apparent. And not just intra-ethnic and sectarian, so not just Sunni Shia or Kurdish Shia, whatever, but very much intra. The biggest conflict currently in Iraq is actually intra-Shia, but that goes beyond the, which has a lot to do with radicalization. It has not to do with jihadism, but it has a lot to do with radicalization. But I think I am coming to the end of my time here as well, and I'm perfectly happy to answer more questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pastori, for adding this level of complexity, and also for giving a short, concise overview of what the EU is and is not doing in that respect. I'd like to open the floor now for the Q&A. I know that both Ms. Pastori and Ms. Elham need to leave quite soon, so I would collect some questions, 2 or 3, and if you can maybe start by addressing those questions to these 2 speakers, and then we'll move to the others, if that works for you. And by posing the question, please also introduce yourself and keep concise. So we have one question here and one there.
Thank you, Hussein Baji, the previous speaker. And thank you very much for all this wonderful background and deep information. 2 questions, one to you and one to Elham. Now, first of all, 4 caliphs have been assassinated after Prophet Muhammad. Assassination is not new thing in Islamic world. Hassan al-Sabah is the most important one who has created this group. Now, the issue is, my question to you, in the final analysis, you came to the same conclusion. I think in the Middle East is so complicated that we cannot make a sound analysis. No. When I was talking about the American position, I'm coming from Turkey, and all the American diplomats, politicians who come to Ankara, they talk to us. I'm the local, if you want, academic, dealing with them. How do we see? When I say America made a mistake in the sense of Bush administration, going from there to Obama administration. Obama was in Ankara when he was addressing. When he was in Ankara, I was one of the listeners to him. He was talking to us about the democracy, about the human rights, etc. And he went to Cairo, and he was talking about the reconciliation with Islam, because during the Bush period, of course, it was not a good picture in the Middle East after the American intervention in 2003. My question is to you. This ISIS, as well as the radicalization of the Middle East, don't you see that the main reason has been the wrong policies of the United States of America in particular in this region? Or do you think that Americans have been right? When I do read the book from Woodward, The State of Denial, is giving me a lot of information. What is your position? Who is responsible? Let me put it like this. Or who is getting more share in it? To Elham, I try to understand you, as you said, but you have given a very good, I would say, background. My question to you, are we going to experience a renaissance in the minds of the people in the Middle East? Are we going to have a change of mindset from radicalization to more democratic understanding, which was the aim of Arab Spring?
Thank you very much. I would propose I take this other question and then we revert to the first 2 speakers.
Thank you to all the speakers. My name is Marco Funk. I'm with the EU Institute for Security Studies, and I had a question about Saudi financing of Salafi ideology abroad, and I'm trying to understand how that specifically plays out within the context of the agreement between the religious establishment and the royal family in Saudi Arabia, which, as you mentioned previously, the royal family is mainly in charge of, let's say, foreign affairs and oil affairs, dealing with the outside world, let's say, whereas the religious establishment is mainly responsible for what goes on inside the country. And yet, when we see this export, let's say, of the Salafi ideology abroad, that seems to be somewhat contradictory to me with the previous statement. So I just wanted a clarification on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to start?
Very short answer to a rather long question. First, sound analysis I can give you. I can only not give you a short analysis, but sound analysis I can give you. It's difficult, but not rocket science. And secondly, apart from the fact that I'm not the spokesperson for the Americans, I'm a European. You gave me two options: are they right or are they responsible? I'm telling you, neither nor. Well, I'm not an academic, I'm a diplomat, so guess what?
9/11 happened.
It's legitimate.
9/11 happened.
Yes.
Okay. And would you blame the United States for that right now? It's like when I look at 9/11 and I see that attack, then I see a certain kind of a context that the Iraqi war was not there. All of these grievances were not there. So blaming the United States alone, and again, I'm not a spokesman for the United States, and I have certain strong critique, specifically when it concerns the way they are, when they are dealing with Yemen. Nevertheless, I don't think that when it comes to this, it's the answer, not from my perspective at least. Now, when it comes to Renaissance, I believe we will reach a point where we are fed up with blood. But it will take a long time. It will really take a long time, because you see it in Yemen, we are slaughtering each other. And you see it in Syria, you see it in Iraq, and we are slaughtering each other. You know, and because of that, when you think of it, we will reach Pakistan, all of these grievances. This one day will push us to a point where we realize there are other ways of living together, and religion, with all due respect, as I practice my religion, religion has to be separated from state in order for us to come to a solution.
We have done it. Turkey, we have done it since 90 years.
But nevertheless, you have the problem of military rule, and then so I'm not going to basically. Yeah, but again, the Renaissance it will come one day through the work, and I see a certain global movement taking shape these days, and it's in the Middle East, it's in Pakistan, it's in Bangladesh, in London, and one day, yes, this is like I might be a dreamer, but I believe we will reach to a point where we realize that human is the center of whatever our aspiration will be. Now, I will go back to your point. It's just like that was like basically someone, that was a different question. When it comes to you're very right when you said it's contradictory, what I said, you know? If you look, you will see when it comes within Saudi Arabia, yes, you had this kind of like agreement within Saudi Arabia. You will not basically shape the outside kind of outcome of our oil policy, arm deals, foreign policy. But look at Saudi Arabia itself and the foreign policy that it adopted. And you see two types of foreign policies. One I wrote up my PhD on Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Sultanate of Oman. One that you could call the foreign policy, the religious foreign policy of Saudi Arabia, and it's situated within the context of the Cold War, of fighting thereafter the Iranian influence. It has a purpose. And together, they were working together. Yeah, it's just like you see the Global Muslim League, its role until today in exporting this type of fundamentalism. And that said, on the other side, you have the realist foreign policy in Saudi Arabia. And I always describe it to my students as, think of it as someone with two heads. Yeah, sometimes when I speak to you with this head, it's basically I talk with you with sense, money, and arm deal, and let's just basically have business and drink whiskey afterwards. You know, and the other one is basically the one with the beard and the sucker. And right now we are going to spread this message everywhere. But it has a purpose, from my perspective as a politician.
Can I add half a sentence to this? Because you mentioned the Foreign Affairs establishment, it is really interesting to see that actually right now in the foreign policy establishment in Saudi Arabia, there is not a single royal left, because you said the regime. They're all commoners now. From the minister, honestly, this is the first time in history and would have been unthinkable only half a year ago. You don't have a single royal anymore in the foreign ministry if you go since the last reshuffle. So there's a huge change also on that side. I just wanted to add that perspective.
Thank you very much. I think it's also important to add nuances in this debate. I think yeah, sure. We've often look at the Gulf as a sort of monolith and something very stable and very rigid, completely immune from transformation, and maybe it's time to revise this a bit in light of what's happening. I would open the floor to another round of questions and comments from the audience. One question there. Also wanted to chip in, maybe.
Just a couple of quick points.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a question for the two gentlemen. So you said because they leave, we spare time for the ladies.
Sure. I think we still have some 10, 15 minutes before both leave. So I would open the floor to more questions, and then we can organize accordingly. But Ed, maybe you
on the question about blaming and who should do something, is it America? I spent 4 years working in the US, the Council on Foreign Relations, so I have no qualms in defending America, and I'd gladly say I'm a spokesperson because I love the country, I love the people, I love the worldview, I love the ideology that drives the place. Without America's heavy lifting, I think Europe would be in a very difficult place now, and if it wasn't for America's heavy lifting in the 1930s and 40s, Europe would certainly be in a different place now. So America gets a lot of bashing, and it's fashionable to do so in Europe. But I'd ask the question, back to our friends and allies in the region, what stopped the Saudis, the Turks and the Egyptians acting in Syria? What stops you from acting now? Rather than this constant blaming on Europe and blaming on American shoulders, whether it's the question of the PKK, whether it's the question of President Erdogan advocating democracy and then not going the whole hog, whether it's Prime Minister Davutoglu's zero problems with any of the neighbors policy to now 100 problems with 100 neighbors. So there's been a strategic failure in Turkey's foreign policy thinking over the last 2 decades, and to now put all of that blame on American and Western shoulders without owning up to Turkey's domestic problems, including what's going on today, last week, last month. I mean, every day Turkey is in the news for a man at the helm who, isn't the kind of gentleman that you described that had altogether embraced a secular political model. So there are problems, I think, inside the region. And one way of approaching this, and I'll be just a minute, I'll finish the answer very quickly, is to say that Ilham's right, there is a mood and momentum around the world now for, especially in the Muslim world, for some kind of change. What happened with Al-Nahda in Tunisia is absolutely vital. I do believe that people who were once with the Muslim Brotherhood can change their view. I do believe that humans are capable of altering their minds. If they're not, what we're doomed to is 40,000 plus people in the Egyptian prisons languishing. And many of the political leaders today in the Arab world were once part of Ikhwan or Al-Nahda or Hizb al-Tahrir and others. So people do change and shift. And I think Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi's shift is genuine. I think he believes in the maqasid. I've sat with him in Washington, in New York, at the Council and the Wall Street Journal, and he's much more of a center-right, conservative, small C politician. That's welcome, I think. But it's worth just us all thinking collectively that this continent was part of similar problems that we're seeing across the Middle East. The rise of political extremism, the rise of dictatorships, the free movement or the forced movement of refugee flows, the intolerance of religious and ethnic minorities that led to the Holocaust. 4 major problems facing this region 60 years ago and previous centuries before that. Today, what we're seeing with all of its problems is a culture of an architecture of unity, debate, dialogue, solving common problems together. And my appeal to friends from the Middle East is that all of your problems are regional problems: water shortage, unemployment, youth bulge, extremism, border contentions. You're not going to solve them on your own in Turkey or in Egypt or in Iran or in the Gulf, and you've got to come together. There's fatigue in the West in trying to come to your aid over and over and over again. They're your problems. You address them, we come to your help as allies. When you don't do it, we come and we try and fix it with all of our difficulties and prejudices, and then we get blamed for getting it wrong. So there's a reason why there isn't a kind of Western presence in Syria, because of the blame we're getting for Iraq. So you can't damn us if we do and damn us if we don't, and then not act. So my appeal to you and others in the region would be, take ownership of your own problems and overcome them.
Thank you very much.
I'm not a diplomat, I can say that.
I can say all of this, but it wasn't a question. I just answered the question.
It lays with the words, but I have also an answer.
Okay.
Perfect English.
I think Mr.
Yeah.
Mr. Friedi wanted to comment on some issues before we move
Now,
on.
the problem is not only inside the region,
Exactly.
and the professor has right,
Exactly.
and we cannot, hide the criminal responsibility of United States, of Tony Blair government, and other government who destroyed a complete state and the regime with its army, with its ministries, and in one night because of this very stupid and ignorant president and the administration of Mr. Bush. And if we say that we are not against United States, of course, I'm not entitled to say it, but I feel what President Obama achieved with Iran is a great success in the international diplomacy. But we cannot say, this is the problem of the region. But the occupation of Palestine, now since 1967, just everybody, every expert can tell you there is no more viable two-state solution because of the Israeli settlement. So you cannot just say, I agree with you, this is our future, we have to take our decision, we have to be, not to throw our responsibility on others. I have 100% agree with you, but you cannot ignore that the United States, United Kingdom, destroyed a sovereign country based on lies. Based on lies. I mean, the United Nations analysts or experts said that very loudly. Hans Blix asked few weeks, and they destroyed Iraq. So why,
So
if
nobody
they destroyed?
said there is no fault. The question was, is it their responsibility or are they right? And I think our answer, we both said the same thing, neither nor. There were a lot of mistakes made, but this is not the answer to the problem. And I suggest we now move on, because we can discuss about Iraq for a long time.
No, because Daesh is there. Daesh is a result of that. Daesh is not a result of the Muslim Brotherhoods. Daesh is a result of the Iraqi destruction, state destruction, plus, of course, sectarian policies and all what has been built after that.
Thank you. Can we take more questions on these or other topics, maybe? There's one question over there, and one over there, and later we'll get back to this.
Thank you. I'm Tommaso Virgili from the European Foundation for Democracy. I have a question for Mr. Friedi. Back in 2013, in June, right before Tahrir episode 2, let's say, I had a conversation with a scholar and the wife of a very vocal human rights activist at the American University in Cairo. And she was comparing the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood as a very radical one, with which it was impossible to engage, to the Ennahda and to Ghannouchi. And my question was, but is Ghannouchi smarter or is Ghannouchi really more moderate? So I think from your word, I can argue the answer to this question, but I would still like to have your view on the differences, if there are, in ideological terms, between the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, at least before they were denied because of the political repression, and the Ennahda. Thank you.
Thank you. I would take the other question from the audience and then revert to the panel.
My name is Katarina Lindahl. I'm from the European Commission, DG Employment. I would like to perhaps disaggregate the perspective a little bit, just for a short while. It has come across very clearly that no one believes that there is one answer in terms of drivers and motivations. It's a very divergent pictures between the regions concerned and also within the regions. My question would be perhaps mainly to Mr. Hussein, but also to the other panelists. You said that factors that we normally refer to as important in this context, like exclusion, poverty, alienation, and things like that, may contribute, but they are not major drivers. But I'm sure you would not like to suggest that we cannot pursue policies in those fields and other fields apart from external policy and security policy that can be helpful in breaking grounds for recruitment, in finding good ways to deal with return jihadists and so on. So my plea would be a little bit if you and other panelists could perhaps give some hopeful suggestions in terms of policies that can be helpful in this regard.
Thank you very much. Any more questions at this point? Last one and two.
To Mr. Ed, this blaming is, for me, it's kind of a epidemic. It's a collective disease. I belong to Pakistan, and I see that no issue in Pakistan has anything to do with the state and society itself. It has to do primarily with Yahud and Nasara. You know, we just cannot accept any blame, even partially. Like Dhaka debacle. 25 years East Pakistan was Pakistan. And it's a long story what we did to them. It's so obvious and so well documented. But if you now ask, the official explanation is that it was the Hindus and supported by Americans. Whatever, you go to barber shop, teachers, columnists, vernacular media, it's consensus across that infidels, Christians, Jews, and now the Hindus, particularly regarding Pakistan, is Yehudo Nasara, Yehudo Hunudo Nasara. Now I come to migrate to Europe and I see different Muslim diasporas and I see the same disease. I call it a disease. The collective sense of defeatedness and self-victimhood, self-pity, a very widespread. Does it have to do with basic ideological and faith-based, like faith system, like this concept of Yehuda Nasara, very much Quranic concept? And how to tackle this? As you say, own your problem. And the word is very bad. Everybody is pursuing the dirty game. But we also have to do something. Saddam Hussein was also the part of the problem. It's not only America.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me get to the last two questions. Very concise, please, so we can revert to the panel and have a quick round of replies. Yeah, please.
My question is to Ed Hussein. You're the author of the best-selling book, The Islamist. Could you just say, because the book is about your own personal experience, about being radicalized and then being unradicalized, could you possibly just give us a couple of words on your own experience? I mean, what took you in and then what took you out, if I can put it like that?
Thank you. Would you like to maybe start to address the question on Nakhta?
On the 2013, the Islamic government had to resign, and Mr. Ghannouchi showed, it's true, a great deal of pragmatism. This comes after the military coup in Egypt. But in Tunisia, one can say we had a kind of civilian coup against Ennahda, because we have all kind of civil society organization, plus the parliament, plus trade union organization asked this government has to resign. So Mr. Ghannouchi, it's true, he's a very clever man, I can say he's a moderate. I can say he's a pragmatic. He learned that in Britain and in Europe, and he is very clever to see the future of his movement is by dealing with the others. This is what the Muslim Brotherhoods in Egypt did failed to learn, and they showed, as the head of the Syrian opposition told me yesterday, Asad al-Abda told me that they failed to understand, or they showed they do not know their own society, the Muslim Brotherhoods in Egypt. But in Tunisia, it's true that Rashid al-Ghannouchi showed that he knows this Tunisian society, and I think he knows very, very well the vital part of the society. I mean, the seculars, I mean, the women organization, the culture of the country, and all in all, participate in his conviction that it's better for him to resign and to go back to the power than to get into confrontation, because I am sure in 2013 we were about to go into confrontation in the street, not only of him, but believe me, the other part of the society was ready to go into confrontation without having a strong army with us, let's say. Now, just one sentence about, you asked a very, very interesting question. Why all these suicide bombers are coming from this and this and this and this? In the history, you have the Japanese during the Second World War. And in the recent history, you had, this started with Hamas fight, with the jihadist fight against Israel.
Tamil Tigers.
Huh?
Tamil Tigers.
So we have to look to that, have to look the Sunni culture. We have a problem of culture in the Sunni thinking. And I think Sunni intellectuals have to work on that, but it takes time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hussein, would you like to address
Sure. I mean,
some of the
several
questions?
points. I'll be quick, because at the end of the day, I don't want to kind of
Thank you.
bore people. So on the exclusion front, I mean, you're absolutely right that, you know, those are factors, and I think when you look internationally, whether it's USAID or whether it's DFID, various government departments and the equivalent here are working on the soft arm, if you like, of integration, of belonging, of identity. But my point was that there isn't really a focus on the ideology in the way that there was during the Cold War, that we identified that there was communism and the ideological undercurrents had to be defeated. And that conviction isn't here in the West at this juncture because we're afraid of our values, because we think these are our values. What we've failed to grasp is that they're universal values, and people in the Muslim world, in the Middle East in particular, want exactly those values. And the evidence for that was the millions of people who came out during the Arab Spring. So yes, it's geopolitical, but I mean, your steer was more towards policies that could help on the soft side. And I can't be specific and provide prescriptions that are detailed, but I can provide an overall strategic direction, I think. And in that, what I would encourage you to think about are the following areas. First, gender equality. It's often the case that whether it's as partners at work, whether it's at the various capacities in which men and women interact, women tend to know more, and women, whether it's the influences the Israelis have illustrated by getting young women closer to extremists and thereby helping them A, be de-radicalized, and B, become informants. So I don't think we've either approached it like that or understood the power of gender in tackling the extremist issue. And it may not be politically correct, but it's worth us thinking about that many of the young men that turn very early on towards extremism and violence do so because there's a huge gap in their personal life. And often what you find is the moment they either fall in love or they make proposals for marriage or they have children, case study after case study proves that there's a correlation in them being less active in that underworld of extremism and terrorism. So what I'm trying to get at is getting away from this narrow worldview that unless I'm married, I can't have a relationship with anyone and therefore I'm sinful. So better explaining that you can be respectful towards your partner, being in a relationship with someone doesn't always necessarily have to mean that they've got to move in with you. I mean, Turkey does that exceptionally well. Increasingly, Egypt does it exceptionally well, that because the economic circumstances aren't such that a couple can't move in, doesn't mean they don't get married. So there's stuff around social policy that we ought to be thinking about. I think a second area would be the teaching of European history. In the UK, it's not done often enough and it's not done well enough. That what happened here with the French Revolution and prior to that, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the difficult lessons of the Reformation. The Reformation didn't go well, the Counter-Reformation didn't go well. The subsequent Enlightenment, where we are, the French Revolution, the context of that, Rousseau on the one hand, and Burke, I think, is hugely instructive, Edmund Burke's thinking, and how he pushed back against the iconoclastic French egalitarian mindset. And there are lots of semblances that should be rolled out in our curricula, not just for Muslims and radicalization, but also for preserving European history and thought. So that's, I think, another area that we're not focused enough and often enough. But a third area that comes to mind, again, in broad terms, and that's something that's we're struggling across Europe, and we will do more of that as people from Syria and the Sahel region and in future Africa come into Europe, is that what is Europe? What does Europe stand for? And it may sound like it's a hard question, it's a big question, but we've got to answer that because it's a civilizational struggle. On the other side, they're very clear. They don't recognize Sykes-Picot. They don't recognize the 22 borders across the Middle East. They want to single the global caliphate. Their call is very black and white. Our call is very nuanced, caveated, and they poke fun at us and say we suffer from what they call analysis paralysis. And we saw some of that on display today. So those 3 or 4 policy areas are worth pursuing, but maybe we can talk about that offline and we can brainstorm together to come to something more specific that you think would be helpful. But my last area in terms of policy prescriptions would be something that needs to be focused on Europe's neighborhood, and that is what Europe's put in place with all of its difficulties, the architecture of a European Union where some sovereignty is sacrificed and pooled together in order to address the common problems of the region is something, by the way, European ingredients for integration is much lower than Middle Eastern ingredients for integration, regional integration, common religion by and large, common language by and large, common history by and large, common culture by and large. Those factors aren't present here, and yet Europe has moved towards integration in a way. In the Arab world, it's a huge aspiration. The Saudi king, when he was in Egypt recently, the opening of the bridge or an announcement of the bridge was an allusion to that desire for greater unity. So that's something that the Europeans can take to the Middle East, and it will be welcomed in a way that if the Americans or the Brits did, it wouldn't be welcomed. So there I think you have something for a long-term addressing of the policy question as to what happens in Europe. Blame game, self-pity, East Pakistan, West Pakistan is faith to blame. I don't think, there is one interpretation of faith to blame, absolutely, and you're spot on, it is an epidemic. We all grow up with that kind of everyone's against us. I think Bernard Lewis put it well when he said, Muslims historically haven't had the experience of living as minorities. Wherever we've been in a position of power. Even if we were the minority in Mughal India, we were the powerful elite. Even if we were the minority in Damascus, coming from the Hijaz region, we were the Umayya elite. Same in Turkey, 1453 onwards, we were first the elite. So that mindset of being the ruling class to now being literally the working class or just a citizen and not being the powerful hasn't quite sunk into the Muslim psyche. That this is a new world. This is a new modern era, and we're all citizens. It's not about us dominating. So the domineering instinct within Muslims, the supremacist mindset, is there and it needs to go, but it will go only when we question it. But I would deflect from the faith for the following reason, that historically Muslims were a confident people. And when you have that confidence, you don't blame others. The fact that we have Hindus in India, we have Christians in Spain, we have Orthodox Christians and others in Egypt and in the Balkans is testament to the fact that the Ottomans and the Mughals ruled in a way that allowed for coexistence and pluralism. And that's why we have those people there now. Otherwise, they would have been forced to become Christians and adopt other faiths. But the broad point I'm making, because the chair's getting uncomfortable, so I'll very quickly finish, is that when you say faith, but from a Quranic point of view, when Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, and same in biblical terms, they didn't blame Satan. They blamed themselves. They addressed it themselves. So, you can use faith in both ways, but I think you point to a wider epidemic, and I think it's more to do with confidence, civilization, and getting over the fact that we will not become a dominant, superior civilization. Those days are over. That supremacist tendency of blaming Indians and, as you say, Jews and Christians has to go, and the more of us that speak out against it, the more it will go. But the good news is there is a reversal of that now. You slowly start to see glimmers of hope where, yes, Salman Taseer is a bad example of what happened to a good man, but I think over time what you will see is people being more and more critical. And I'll end by saying that it's hard not to be critical if you're joined up to the World Wide Web, if you're exposed to global politics, if you're watching the mainstream news. It's hard for Muslims not to be introspective and realize that we have a problem within the House of Islam.
Thank you very much. Professor May, is there anything you would like to add
as a
final remark? Okay. Then I think time has come to close this event. I think we covered indeed lots of ground, and not only metaphorically speaking, lots of different regions we looked into, but also lots of different themes. We look at ideology, we look at local politics, regional geopolitics, even basic human behavior, if I may say so, and how these interact all together and create a great deal of analytical complexity, which, however, shouldn't hide some concrete responses. And I think, if I may try to synthesize a bit, maybe one key point, one key message perhaps, is that everybody should take a greater deal of responsibility in tackling these problems. It has to do with the regions affected and the countries and the governments and the people in those regions, but also the international community at large. I think there's still a big role that Europe and others can play in addressing the overall complexity of this challenge, but also the very concrete and dangerous impacts that radicalization, extremism may have on citizens and society at large. So let me conclude this by thanking very much the speakers who took the time to be with us, both in this panel and in the previous one. Let me thank the partners, the European Foundation for Democracy, for the continuing support and partnership in this project. We will continue reflecting on these and other issues in the projects that we started already several weeks ago, looking at the jihadist radicalization, the consequences, the challenges for Europe and beyond. And please stay with us for the next few events on this topic. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.